You're here to see a book signing by Richard Clarke, and I must say, as I think many of us know, Richard, although he was in the government for some 30 years, I think came to most of our attention in 2004 when he appeared on both 60 Minutes. His book Against All Enemies came out in that period, and he also testified before the 9/11 Commission. And that was Against All Enemies. Later he wrote a book that greatly impressed me, and that was Your Government Failed You. And I think for a gentleman who served for 30 years, served in the top ranks of government, served President Reagan, he served in the White House of President Reagan, George Bush 41 and George Bush 43, as well as of President Clinton, dealing with matters of cybersecurity, terrorism, and our infrastructure in regards to national security issues. Having served in those positions and to come out and do a book called Your Government Failed You, I thought was a remarkable thing to do. I thought it was a superb book, and it made me a fan from then on. The thing I think that I'm very impressed by the book that he has just brought out, Cyberwar, which, by the way, is available in the back for signing. Richard said he would stay late to sign, stay after the presentation to sign copies. I think one of the things that impressed me is the clarity of the book. He speaks early on of a meeting he held with others trying to get their hands around this particular issue, the cybersecurity issue. And he made a commitment with others to try and bring these issues, such as cybersecurity, into public discourse. And that was a personal commitment, and this book is part of what he has done to fulfill that. So that is very impressive. Richard, it is a pleasure to have you here today. So the stand is yours. Please help me. Here, you can come up here and got it? Okay. Thank you. Okay.
Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I love the Spy Museum and have been a fan since the day it opened. And I know many of you have as well. And thank you for taking your lunch hour to come and talk with me about cyber war. The name of the book is Cyber War, but it really talks about three distinct phenomena. Cyber war is one of them. But cyber espionage is also one of them. And the third is cyber crime. The three phenomena, and I'll try to define each of them, but the three phenomena all occur because of what happened in the 1990s. In the 1990s, without our really thinking about it or planning it as a nation, or having any real discourse about it, we suddenly realized that this thing that had been around for about a decade or two at that point, the Internet, held real promise in allowing us to do a huge variety of things far more cheaply. And so by moving functions that used to be performed person to person or through the mail into cyberspace, onto the Internet and the other networks that make up cyberspace, a lot of organizations were able to reduce their costs. And gradually this began occurring in the 1990s, and it's no coincidence that if you look at the economic statistics in the 1990s, two other things happened. One, America's productivity went through the roof, especially compared to the rest of the world. And two, our economy boomed because we were lowering our costs of operation and opening up this whole new industry, the IT industry. And it all seemed like a great thing, and it was. 1990s looked pretty good in retrospect compared to where we are now. But there was a downside, and that is that we were beginning to use a system that was designed for one purpose. We were beginning to use it for a whole series of other purposes for which it was not designed and not very good. The Internet was designed, as most of you know, as a communications network for research professors at leading American universities. And it never occurred to the people who designed it, I know because I've talked to them, that there would ever be any abuse on the Internet. Because after all, these were just research professors exchanging information, accessing databases, accessing libraries, collaborating across country on projects. Never occurred to them that there would be anybody like us using the internet. Us untrustworthy, unwashed people, the public, let alone that the Defense Department, the banking system, and everything else would start using the internet. Not just start using it for emails or for web pages to communicate information, but start using it as an essential element of their functioning. An element so essential that the organizations cannot function anymore without it. And those organizations are pretty much everything when you think about it. So think about airlines. Airplanes take off. Why does that have anything to do with the internet? Well, all too often what you see is that a big airline like Delta or Northwest and Air Canada, it's happened to almost every airline, they have all their airplanes working, all their pilots show up, all their cabin crew shows up, they've got the fuel, they've got everything they need to take off, and the entire corporation's computer network crashes. What happens? Nothing happens. The planes don't take off. You have hundreds of planes sitting on the ground, capable of flying, but the airline can't operate without its computer network. Why? It doesn't know who should be on the plane. It doesn't know what seat they should be in. It doesn't know things like the loading factor on the plane of cargo and people, can't figure out the fuel ratios, so they sit there for hours. Or, and you've seen this happen, the air traffic control sector in one part of the country has a computer hiccup, and the computer system goes down, and planes can't take off because the air traffic controllers can't see them and can't direct them. And every time that happens, and it happens unfortunately about 2 or 3 times a year, if you read the news stories, at the end it says, but there's good news because the computer system that the FAA uses for air traffic control is so old, it's about to be replaced with a new, more digital system operating on Windows. And every time I read that, I go, oh, God, it's just going to get worse. Everything. Trains. I talked to the CEO of the largest or second largest, I'm not sure which, train company, freight railroad company in the United States. And I asked him, so what is your company's reliance on cyberspace? He said, well, I think of our company as basically a computer company with trains. Why? Because we line up these trains and we put cargo onto them, and each car is going to a different location. And each train operating on our network has to go at a different speed. Some have to go fast, some have to go slow, some have to sit on a siding so another one will pass them. They have to stop at different places and drop off cars. Other trains come along and pick them up. And when our computer system fails, we just stop all the trains. I learned last week for the first time that every locomotive in the United States, in all of the freight railroads, receives a download twice a day onto its Windows XP computer. Trains. And you can go through industry after industry. Airplanes, trains, pipelines, the electric power grid. I talk a lot in the book about the electric power grid, so much so that I'm sure it gets a little much after a while. But the electric power grid is all controlled by computers. Computers decide how much power should be generated by each substation, how that power should be routed down what high-tension lines. Because if you put too much power down a high-tension line, the line melts. And if all of the generators aren't spinning on the network at the same rate, they can explode. I know it sounds strange, but it's true. And so the entire eastern electric power grid from Florida up into Canada, the entire western electric power grid from Baja up into Canada, they're all interconnected, one east, one west, and Texas, of course, has to have its own. Those 3 power grids, all controlled, and everything on them controlled by computer networks. And if suddenly something happened to these computer networks, at the banks, at the power grid, at the pipelines, at the trains, could we go back to where we were in the early 1990s and the late 1980s? Could we go back and replace those computers with whatever we did before? So that if somehow someone waved a wand and suddenly all the computers didn't work, what are the backup systems? Well, for a while in the 1990s, early 1990s, there were backup systems. Whatever we had been using before we switched to computer-based controls was still around in some companies. Nowhere today that I've seen are there backup systems available. When I ask CEOs or heads of federal agencies, what if you didn't have a computer network? What could you do? The answer is, well, we send people home when computers go down. Well, what about the backup systems? Well, they're computers. And if you think about this, it's true. I mean, who here can still find a manual typewriter? You have a manual typewriter? Does it work? Well, all right, so you're safe. But for the rest of us, we don't have manual systems. So we're all now reliant. Every major industry, every function that we do all day long, from turning on the lights to getting water out of the tap to getting money out of the ATM machine to getting on the metro to come down here, everything we do is dependent upon computer networks. And most of those computer networks are connected to the internet in one way or another. And they're all operating, most of them, are operating using software protocols that were designed about 20 or 30 years ago and were not designed to be secure. So the basic architecture of the internet, which is most of cyberspace, was never designed to be secure, and it's not. It is not. The result is that it is relatively easy to hack into a lot of things where you shouldn't be. And it's difficult but possible to hack into the things where you really shouldn't be. Let's come back to the electric power grid. What we found in test over test over test when I was in the government was that if you went to the internet, went to the web-facing page of an electric power company, you could almost always hack into the electric power company's public web face. And from there you could hack into their internal network, their intranet, their local area net for their offices. And from there you could then hack into what's called the SCADA system. SCADA is Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. But what it means is the software that runs the power grid. So that in a three-step process, you're able, time and time and time again, and as recently as this year, people have demonstrated it, the ability to hack from the public-facing internet into the corporate network, into the control system. A Chinese graduate student published a little essay earlier this year in Chinese that said, well, you know, all you have to do to bring down the American power grid is hack your way into the least secure of the power grid companies, because they're all interconnected, and you can cause a cascading failure that will cause a blackout. It's nice to know Chinese graduate students have these interesting topics that they write about. You may have seen a story last week that 27% of American youth are obese, and this is a cause of concern for our military because they think that means they won't be able to go into the military. But I saw a great quote last year from an American Air Force two-star general saying, I don't care what their physical condition is, as long as they can hack and take down a power grid. There's a recurring theme around the world of people talking about taking down power grids. So with that as a backdrop, let's talk about the three phenomena: cybercrime, cyber espionage, and cyber war. Cybercrime, you're familiar with. I mean, you know about identity theft, you know about these scams on the internet called phishing with a PH, where it looks like it's your bank that sent you an email, and you click on it as instructed, and what looks like your bank's page opens up in your browser, and you type in your bank password, and It's not your bank. Maybe it jumps to your bank, it connects to your bank after you've put your password in, but actually you've put your password in on some clone site being run by the criminals. They now have your password and your account numbers, say goodbye to your money. Well, so far, most of the banks have been making good when your money is stolen from their bank accounts. But that means the banks are spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year making good theft that's occurring in cyberspace. We're now seeing cyber criminal cartels operating largely in Eastern Europe, but also other parts of the world, where it's not one hacker using his or her skills to engage in cybercrime, but it's scores of people operating together with computer labs. They're attacking software companies so that they're putting in trap doors in software before the software is even sold. So that when you buy, I won't use names, but you buy some software from some company, and unknown to that company, there's a little line of code that the criminals have inserted that allows them to get into your computer. It's getting very sophisticated out there in the world of cybercrime. And the U.S. government prosecutes about 1% of the cybercrime that occurs in the United States. That means cybercrime pays. There are estimates that cybercrime pays in the billions of dollars a year on a global basis. Somebody is getting awfully rich. And those somebodies tend to live in places like Russia, where, oddly enough, when the U.S. government says, we have this computer that was attacked in the United States and we've traced it back as to who did it and would like you to arrest them, the Russians don't arrest them. So there are cyber sanctuaries for these cyber criminals. Growing problem. The United States approach, we say in the book, is bankrupt because essentially the United States says to 90 different U.S. attorneys around the country and 56 FBI offices, it's a criminal activity, you have to prosecute it. They don't have a central organized approach that is able to deal internationally successfully with these cyber sanctuaries. Some of the cyber criminals now are also participating in the second phenomenon, cyber espionage. So if you're a business intelligence firm and you're selling information to, let's say, a big company that makes airplanes in Europe, no names, they want business intelligence perhaps about Boeing, their competitor. So the big European company is not going to hack into Boeing. They don't want to get caught doing that. So they go and they hire a business consulting firm, business intelligence firm. The business intelligence firm then goes out and hires a hacker. And they hack their way into the company. Industrial espionage. It's happening at a prodigious rate. About 18 months ago, the head of British intelligence, domestic intelligence, the British Security Service, MI5, wrote a letter to 300 CEOs in the UK, the 300 largest companies in the UK. And in it, he said, you have to assume that your network has been successfully penetrated by the Chinese government. And any corporate secrets you have been successfully exfiltrated from your network. Now, the U.S. government hasn't written that letter yet, but I can assure you the content, if it did write it, would be the same. Every major U.S. company has been successfully hacked by probably the Chinese government at a minimum, and probably lots of others, and the crown jewels of those companies have been stolen. The results of billions of dollars of research funded by the taxpayers or the stockholders going to competitors who pay nothing for the R&D or pennies on the dollar. Our secrets in aerospace companies, our secrets in pharmaceutical companies, in biomedical companies, our secrets in financial deals, all stolen by either criminal cartels engaging in cyber espionage for hire or by foreign governments. Some of those foreign governments, when they steal information from U.S. corporations, turn around and give that information to companies in their own country. Now, that accusation has been made a lot about the United States from Europeans, particularly the French. The French say, oh, the United States is out there hacking and it's stealing information and giving it to U.S. companies. That's not true. I can assure you it's not true. It's illegal. We don't do it. But other people do. And it has totally changed the nature of espionage. Think about traditional espionage. Think about Aldrich James or someone like that, who was smuggling out pieces of paper. Hansen smuggling out pieces of paper from the FBI building down the street here. Every time he did it at risk of being caught. Taking pieces of paper and putting them in his shoe. And then having to meet his Russian handler in some park somewhere. Or have a dead letter drop in some park in Washington to pass information on. That was traditional espionage. You know how hard that was? First of all, the Russian has to find an American on the inside who would likely do the spying. That target spotting was incredibly intensive. It took most of the time of spies, target spotting. Then you find the person who might provide the information. You have to persuade them. You have to pay them. You have to do all of this manipulation. And it's very risky. And what do you get as a result? You know, a shoebox filled with paper. In 1 hour, a hacker can get into a network and exfiltrate equivalents of the Library of Congress. Terabytes of information out the door in minutes, certainly in hours. And most of the time this happens, the companies or the institutions involved don't notice it at the time. Most of them notice it after the fact when they check their logs, but sometimes even then they don't know that this information has been exfiltrated successfully. Cyber espionage has totally changed the world of spying. Cyber war. What's cyber war? How is that different? Last October 1st, the United States government opened something called U.S. Cyber Command, which is headed by General Keith Alexander, who's either gotten his 4th star or is about to get his 4th star. So U.S. Cyber Command is a military organization that includes Navy units, Air Force units. The Navy stood up something called the 10th Fleet. 10th Fleet has no ships. The Air Force stood up something called the 24th Air Force, which has no planes or no missiles. The 10th Fleet and the 24th Air Force report to Cyber Command, and their battle space is cyberspace. So we have military organizations designed to fight in cyberspace. And we're not alone. In public testimony, Leon Panetta, the CIA director, has said between 20 and 30 nations now have military organizations similar to Cyber Command, designed to fight in cyberspace. Well, how do you fight in cyberspace? You're envisioning Keanu Reeves in The Matrix or something. Not quite. Not quite. No kickboxing is required. What do you do? What I talked about at the beginning. If you're on the offensive, you hack your way into those systems on which we all depend. You hack your way into the control system for a power grid and cause a blackout. Well, you say, that's a nuisance, but I can flick the switch and turn the power back on. Well, maybe. But maybe the attack was designed to cause lasting damage to the power grid. Maybe it melted high-tension wires and caused generators to spin out and explode before it caused the blackout. If that were true, the blackout would last for weeks, if not months. What if the attack was on the railroads and caused at key junctions on the freight rail networks there to be massive derailments, causing days, if not weeks, when the railroads wouldn't work and supplies couldn't move? What if it was on the air traffic control system or the airlines, and we were grounded for days, the way Europe was last month because of the volcano? What if all that happened at the same time? And what if, in addition to attacking those civilian infrastructures, the military organization that was attacking also attacked the other military? So they turned off the communication system of the other military. Perhaps they turned off the air defense of the other military. To make this clear, let me give you one example of how that could work. Cyberwar, the book, opens with a scene in Syria in 2007. Syrian air defense operators are sitting there at night, almost midnight. They're looking at their radar screens. There's not much up in the air in Syria at that time of day, time of night. Nothing going on. All is well. At the exact same moment that they thought the sky was empty, the sky was filled with Israeli F-15s and F-16s that had flown through Turkey and then done a right hook and come down into Syria to blow up a secret nuclear facility in the corner of Syria up near the Turkish border. They bombed it, destroyed it, and escaped, and never once did any of those big F-15s and big F-16s show up on Syria's radar screens. And the F-15s and F-16s were designed in the 1970s, and they're big, and they reflect radar like a Christmas tree lighting up. But they never appeared on the Syrian radar screens. Because before Israel launched its planes, it launched its cyber attack. Secretly took over the Syrian air defense network and gave the Syrian air defense operators an image that Israel wanted them to see, which was, nothing's happening. Those explosions you hear in the background and those airplanes you hear flying overhead must be someone's TV. So cyber war has already started. There are examples of cyber war. Estonia was attacked a few years ago. Its banking system, its government ministries, its phone system crashed. People from Russia, perhaps the Russian government, but people in Russia did it. A year later, when Russia invaded the nation of Georgia, as their tanks were rolling across the border into Georgia, their cyber attack was simultaneously occurring, bringing down communication systems, banking, and other key functions of the Georgian government. It's not a theory. It's happened. It's happened on a small scale. It's happened somewhat primitively, but it has happened in the real world. And we know that a lot more can be done than has happened in cyberspace. So, is this a good thing? Cyber war may be better than other wars, right? People don't really get killed in cyber war. It's clean, it's neat. We don't have to do calisthenics. Well, we argue in the book that cyber war probably is not a good idea. That if we could put that toothpaste back into the tube, we would. Unfortunately, we can't. We argue that cyber war is not a good idea for two major reasons. One, the United States is relatively defenseless in case it is attacked in cyber war. And two, cyber war can lead pretty quickly to a shooting war. And so you might think, well, it's only a cyber war, let's do it. And the next thing you know, all hell has broken loose. I said the United States is relatively defenseless. I know a lot of you thinking, well, why is that? How could that possibly be? Well, we're really good on the offense. Cyber Command and other units in the U.S. military and intelligence community have been doing this stuff for years. They invented it. They're really good at it. And you have to assume that anything anybody else is doing, probably the United States government is doing too, only better. So when you read about all those Chinese attacks, hacking into Google and everything else in America, somebody's probably doing it to China. But we have no plan, no system, no strategy to defend this country against cyber attack. Cyber Command has a mission that involves not only offense, but Cyber Command is also supposed to defend the military and the intelligence community. And the Department of Homeland Security, which is so good at everything else, their mission is to be capable someday of defending the rest of the federal government. Okay, so maybe someday we'll have the federal government covered, and we'll probably have the military and the intelligence community covered now. What about all that other stuff? What about the power grid and the railroads and the airplanes and the banks and all those things that make the country work? All those things on which the government and the military depend just as much as we do. There's no plan to defend them. There is no government agency who thinks its job is to defend them. And given the nature of our society, our economy, our laws, our Congress, it would be very difficult for us to set up a system to defend what is 80% of our cyberspace. Now, do you think China has that problem? Do you think Russia has that problem? In Russia, there's one big internet service provider. They don't have Verizon and AT&T and all these people competing. There's one really big internet service provider. And it's owned by the Russian government and largely run by their version of the National Security Agency. China has already started architecting and designing its cyberspace so that they can shut it off from the rest of the world. They have drawbridges in cyberspace that they can pull up and isolate the country. And they can filter for content running through their cyberspace. In other words, they've thought about defending against the cyber war. And they have a system. It's not perfect, but they have a system. China does, Russia does. And then there's little old North Korea. North Korea that can barely feed its people. Actually, it can't feed its people. North Korea staged a little cyber attack on the United States last July 4th. Just a little test to see if they could do it. And they did. They attacked most federal government agencies. It was a simple denial of service attack, an attempt to knock servers off the web. And they did. It was the largest distributed denial of service attack we've ever recorded on the internet. And we're pretty sure North Korea did it. But not from North Korea, because they don't have any internet. They don't have any cyberspace in North Korea. They barely have TV. So they sent their cyber warriors to China and to South Korea, and that's where they launched their cyber attack. So if North Korea staged a big cyber attack on us, and we wanted to attack them back in cyberspace, they have no cyberspace for us to attack, which is the best solution you could ever have for defending cyberspace. You know the 3 laws of cybersecurity. No? The first law of cybersecurity is don't have a computer. Well, you have to have a computer. Well, if you have to have a computer, then the second law of cyberspace applies. Don't turn it on. And you have to turn it on. Then the third law of cyberspace applies. If you have to have a computer and you have to turn it on, don't plug it into anything, like the internet. That's kind of the North Korean approach to defense. But we don't have an approach to defense. Unfortunately, the Bush administration and the Obama administration's philosophy is we'll defend ourselves, and the rest of you in the private sector, you're on your own. It's a bit like if in the Cold War, when the Russians had all those bombers that were designed to come over here and bomb our industry, it's a bit like the U.S. government, Dwight Eisenhower and John Kennedy turning to the private sector, saying to U.S. Steel, the CEO of U.S. Steel. You have all those steel plants in Pittsburgh. And in a war, the Russian bombers are going to come and bomb them. So U.S. Steel, you ought to go out and buy some air defense. That's not what they said. That's not what Eisenhower and Kennedy said. Eisenhower and Kennedy said the United States government will defend against a Russian attack. But today, we're being told we're on our own. We have to defend against cyber war, cyber espionage, cyber crime. Not good. So the arguments we make in the book are we need a defense strategy for the whole of our country. And that defense strategy has to be part of an overall strategy for cyber war, which has to be publicly discussed. We don't have a national strategy for cyber war. The Congress doesn't know about one. The public doesn't know about one. The media doesn't know about one. And I am reliably informed that there isn't one. So we need a strategy. We need a defensive strategy. And at the end of the book, we suggest we also need not just to focus on cyber war, but to focus on cyber peace. You know, I did arms control for over 2 decades in the State Department. Arms control involving biological weapons, chemical weapons, strategic nuclear weapons, theater nuclear weapons, conventional weapons. Every time we started one of these things, I was told, oh, that's too hard. You're going to fix this for me? It's too hard. You can't do biological arms control. You can't do arms control on things in space. You can't do arms control on chemical weapons. And they were all very hard. But we got arms control agreements on all of them. And those arms control agreements made the world safer. Some of us think the work that the United States did in the Cold War on nuclear arms control probably saved the world, probably stopped or made more difficult, reduced the likelihood of a nuclear war. So we think it's about time to start thinking about arms control in cyberspace, because we know it's difficult. We know there are verification problems. We know you can't trust people. But we know that the military of 20 or 30 nations is moving into cyberspace. So it's about time the arms control people do too, and begin to take baby steps that maybe will get us one day, not to cyber war, but to cyber peace. Thanks very much, and I'll be glad to take your questions. Yes, sir, in the blue shirt.
Yes. Yeah, if you wait for the microphone, everyone can hear the question. Oh, okay. Go.
Keith, is the mic live?
Now it is. Thank you. For nearly half a century, we lived in a world where assured mutual destruction was the key word to keeping the Cold War a Cold War.
Right.
My question to you would be, if there was an hourglass right now with the sand running through it, what kind of a time frame do you put on this current Cold War before it becomes hot?
Well, I think it's hot in the sense that cyber espionage is happening every day, both against governments and against industries. In terms of cyber wars happening, there have been little ones, like Estonia, like Georgia. But nation states are not going to go out and fight a cyber war just because they got some new shiny cyber weapon. You know, 9 nations have had nuclear weapons for decades. And the only time anyone's ever used a nuclear weapon in anger has been us, and that was in 1945. So nations are still responsible actors. That's the good thing about nation states as opposed to terrorists. Nation states will not go to war just because they get a new weapon. But when they choose to go to war next, most nations will involve cyber, either as a component of the war or as a standalone. So imagine for the sake of argument that we get sanctions on Iran. We're trying to get UN sanctions on Iran to stop their nuclear program. Let's say, just as illustrative, that we get UN sanctions, we get an oil embargo on Iran. The Iranians are not going to like that. So they're going to retaliate, they're going to have terrorism attacks in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere. But if they have cyber weapons, which I believe they do, then they could respond to the U.S. Fifth Fleet stopping their oil exports. They could respond not just in the Persian Gulf, but they could respond here by attacking infrastructure here. So that's one scenario that I think is highly plausible. But the point is, whenever nation states go to war, if they're sophisticated modern states, and even if they're North Korea, when they go to war in the future, they will use cyber weapons. And there's not a clock that's driven by the cyber weapons. There's a clock that's driven by other political, military, economic factors. You may see a standalone cyber war, as the attack on Estonia was. You may see it as part of an overall military campaign, as the attack on Georgia was. Yes, sir, in the red sweater.
Based on what you said, the previous agreements in other types of warfare, chemical, biological, nuclear, and so forth, we were able to achieve agreements because there was mutually assured destruction. If you do it to us, we'll do it to you. But based on what you said, we have no defense. What negotiating power would we have to negotiate cyber peace agreements?
Well, we discussed this at some length in the book, that the thing that worked in the Cold War and the nuclear balance was this concept of mutual assured destruction, or MAD. And essentially what MAD said was, if you attack me with nuclear weapons, even if you surprise me, I will have enough nuclear weapons left after your attack to totally destroy you. We, the United States, came up with that theory. We built enough nuclear weapons. We now, by the way, we now know how many, because Hillary Clinton announced, or the Pentagon announced last week, how many nuclear weapons the United States had at the height of the Cold War and how many we have today. It was like 33,000 nuclear weapons at the height of the Cold War, and it's like 5,100 or something today. But the Soviet Union adopted that theory of mutual assured destruction too. So it was mutual, and we both said, you can't hit us with nuclear weapons because if you do, we'll blow up the world. If you try to apply that theory in cyberspace, it breaks down for a lot of reasons. One, you don't really know sometimes who's attacking you in cyberspace, but not with high confidence initially, because you can spoof, you can make it look like somebody's attacking, but it's actually somebody else. Number one. Number two, in MAD, you knew what a nuclear weapon would do. It would ruin your whole day. There were 20,000, is that right? No, 2,200. There were 2,200 nuclear explosions in the atmosphere during the testing period. And so everybody got to see what nuclear weapons could do. And our nuclear weapons and China's and Russia's and England's, they all did the same thing. Very destructive. So there was some confidence in what the war would look like. We're not really sure who has what capability in cyberspace. You can't fly a satellite over China and count the cyber warriors the way we used to fly over and count the missiles and count the tanks and count the bombers. So mutual assured destruction doesn't work too well. And then, as you point out, if you can't defend, if there's an asymmetry in the one country can defend itself really well and the other can't, and if the one that can't is us, then mutually assured destruction doesn't work too well. I still think that there are reasons to negotiate arms control, to prevent accidental war, to prevent escalatory war that gets out of control, because cyber war is very fast. Cyber attacks take place in seconds. They move at almost the speed of light. So there are reasons to do arms control. We're not going to get the kind of arms control treaties that we got for other things. This will be a different kind of regime. But I think if we take baby steps, one little agreement at a time to reduce mistakes, to build confidence, to allow for attribution, ways of figuring out who actually did the attack through international cooperation, I think that's all worth doing. Yes, ma'am.
What is cyber peace? It's interesting what Google just went through in China, clearly different definitions.
So cyber peace, as we define it in the book, is an attempt to create international arms control regimes that make it unlikely that cyber war will happen. So it's things like I just talked about, international agreements to aid in figuring out who does attacks when they occur, international agreements to help each other if attacks are occurring, agreements that will take some target sets off the table. One of the things that happened in the nuclear war business, was we had agreements that we wouldn't blow up. They were never agreements, but they were understandings. We wouldn't blow up each other's cities. And we wouldn't blow up each other's leadership. Because if you blow up the leadership, there's no way of stopping it. So we never had a plan we had a plan, but we didn't intend to decapitate the other side, because you need to have someone to turn the war off. So there were agreements or tacit understandings. We could probably get a tacit understanding or even an international treaty today not to attack international banking, because everybody's invested in everybody else, and the whole international financial system is so interconnected that for most countries, maybe not for North Korea, maybe not for Iran, you could create agreements to say, don't attack this. And before we invaded Iraq the last time, there was a plan to do a cyber attack on the Iraqi banking system, and essentially to steal Saddam Hussein's money so that he couldn't escape the country with his money. And President Bush said no. He was willing to kill 100,000 people and willing to invade and bomb, the country back to smithereens, but he wasn't willing to mess with the banking system. So there are beginning to be understandings about things that could be arms control in cyberspace. And that together is what we call cyber peace. Yes, sir.
Given the apparent necessity for cooperation between government and the private sector to create this cyber defense, and the knowledge everyone has of the reliability of software like Windows produced by the private sector, what role do you see for open source software and security products in the future defensive strategy?
So open source is software that's put together by a collaboration of people around the world, and there are no secrets in it. Everybody can see all the lines of code, and everybody can comment on it and improve it. I think open source is important because it's diverse. If everybody is running the same software and somebody figures out how to hack that software, then everybody's in trouble. So if everybody is running Windows or Apple or whatever, I think that's risky. The more operating systems you have, the greater diversity of operating systems, I think the more likely it is that something's still going to work after an attack. So I'm a big believer in diversity. Open source is a requirement to get that diversity. The open source people like to say they're more secure than the proprietary systems. And you can get a real debate going among computer engineers that would put us all to sleep about whether or not that's true. Yes, sir.
What would you consider to be the actual threshold for determining whether a cyber attack is an act of war? And is there any current international law that would support making that sort of determination, and what's appropriate in terms of retaliation?
Well, we should ask our international law expert sitting 2 rows behind you, but we talk a little in the book about the existing international laws of war and the international agreements that exist, not, for example, there's an international agreement going back to 1939, I think, not to bomb cities. You could construe some kinds of cyber attacks as violating some of the existing international laws, but they were all written without cyber in mind. The only real international agreement that we have is something that the European Union came up with on, and we have joined, and other nations outside of Europe have joined, on international cyber crime. And it's a good first step. Unfortunately, Russia's not in it, Japan's not in it, lots of people are not in it. But there's not very much international law yet. So what would be the threshold of war? Seems to me when a nation state does something that damages or disrupts a network. So if a nation state cyber command comes into another nation's network and turns off the electric power grid, causes trains to derail, causes a real-world damage. That can be erasing a database. I mean, if somebody came in and erased the database of the Deposit Trust Corporation in Lower Manhattan, that's not physical damage, but boy, would it mess up this country. So it seems to me the criteria are a nation-state actor and doing damage or disruption. That's war. That's cyber war. A nation-state going in to the same site, hacking its way in, and collecting information, that's not war. That's espionage. And it turns out in many cases the difference between a penetration to do cyber espionage and a penetration to do cyber war is a few keystrokes. And once you're in, you're in. If you go into that network and you exfiltrate, copy all the data, exfiltrate it, that's espionage. If you go into that network and cause the database to crash and erase or cause the trains to derail, those few more keystrokes have made it war. Yes, ma'am.
With your argument, though, I think you're right about MAD not necessarily, because we can't really identify, so how do you know what's enough? Is it maybe not so much a case of mutually assured destruction, but the second and third order effects of globalization that might limit the ability of, say, China to want to cyber attack us, or even North Korea? Because if North Korea, yes, they don't have a grid to lose, but they rely on China for a lot of support. So if they hurt the United States economically, take down our power grid, it hurts China because China is heavily investing in the United States. So therefore, they're hurting themselves. Is that maybe going to keep everything but, say, a terrorist? Terrorist has nothing to lose, but any country really does, even Iran, because of Russia and French support for them.
So that's an argument not against the probability of cyber war, but against the probability of war. That argument, and we do talk about that in the book, that argument, and we hear it all the time about China, is China owns all of our treasury notes, and we're their big market, and we're so totally economically intertwined that we'd never go to war with each other. I hope that's right. But we're building a hell of a lot of stuff just in case they do, called aircraft carriers and tanks and planes and missiles. I think you have to operate on the assumption that even though there is globalization and there is economic interdependence, human nature hasn't changed, and there will still be wars. If there are wars in the future, unless you're talking about Brunei and Rwanda, those wars are going to involve cyber war. And the economic interdependence notwithstanding, countries still go to war with each other. And there are a lot of people in the Pentagon and down in Tampa at CENTCOM today who are worrying very seriously about the fact that we could go to war with Iran in the next year or two, despite the economic interdependence and globalization that's occurred. So I don't think, I understand your argument, I appreciate it, you may be right, but I don't think it's an argument against the probability of cyber war as much as it is against war itself. And I wish you were right. Yes, sir.
Perhaps you could take one more question. We know
Okay.
you have a busy afternoon,
One more.
and we want to leave time for you to sign some books.
On the aisle.
Okay.
Yes, you.
Yep, I'm coming.
On the issue, back to the issue of being defenseless, if you look back in December of 2008, the Commission, we put out a report on cybersecurity, talked about that, talked about the need for public-private cooperation. Melissa put out her report a couple months later. You had the President almost a year ago to the day talking about cybersecurity. Do you see, now granted, they've had a few things distracting them, but do you see any likelihood that cybersecurity will become a more prevalent issue, and if so, when?
So there have been cybersecurity presidential commissions beginning in 1996, and they've all been very good, and most of what they've suggested hasn't been done or implemented. The 2008 report, it took President Bush until his last year in office to get around to actually having a plan that he funded and acted on. The Bush plan in 2008, the Comprehensive National Cyber Initiative, CNCI, had 12 points, as you know. None of those 12 points were really designed to protect anything except the government. And so the Comprehensive National Cyber Initiative was not comprehensive or national. And it didn't really suggest anything that would protect the power grid or the rail system or the banking system. And that is still our policy. We haven't gone beyond that. I hope my friend Howard Schmidt, who's now at the White House, will go beyond that. I think, and we discuss in the book, that there are real daunting political challenges in the Congress and given all the lobbying that goes on in Washington to get any of these things fixed, because a lot of what it's going to take to defend our cyberspace is a word that's very unpopular on K Street and very unpopular with most people on the Hill here in Washington. And that word is regulation. It's about as awful a word as you can say in Washington. I may not get out of this room alive having said the word regulation. But it's going to take regulation of the Internet itself, of the Internet service providers. It's going to take regulation of the electric power companies, more so than the regulation that's already been passed, because that regulation has no teeth. And all of those decisions are going to take courage, and they're going to take a lot of political skill to get them done so that we can begin to defend ourselves in cyberspace. Unfortunately, the way the United States tends to work is that we don't ever getting around to doing these things. Even though we've been warned that attacks are coming, we don't usually get around to doing anything about them until the attacks take place. I hope that this book will contribute perhaps to the dialogue that's been going on, so that the dialogue will get large enough and loud enough that we might actually solve this problem before the disaster. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Richard, for being with us today. And we have some books in the back, so we'll run you back there. We know you have a full schedule. Thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. We're trying to put on some hot topics in the panel and bring in people on contemporary issues. So thank you. Have a good afternoon.